At 56, after nearly 3 decades of what she thought was a shared life, Clara Vance walked out of the probate attorney's office with nothing but her mother's old silver locket, a bruised ego, and a rusted key wrapped in an envelope. Her ex-husband, Julian, a high-end real estate mogul, had spent the last 2 years of their separation hiding assets, shifting bank accounts, and employing a team of ruthless lawyers who made sure Clara looked like an entitled stranger in the eyes of the court. Julian kept the penthouse in the city, the summer home in the Hamptons, and the pristine reputation he so desperately craved. Clara was left with a single, bizarre asset that Julian's lawyers didn't even bother to contest: an old, boarded-up clock repair shop on a forgotten corner of a dying industrial town, 3 hours north of the city. It was a property that had belonged to her late father, Arthur Vance. Arthur had been the town's clockmaker, a man who lost his sight entirely in his final 15 years, but somehow continued to repair the most intricate mechanisms by touch alone. When he died, Julian had told Clara the shop was a liability, a worthless pile of bricks not worth the property taxes. And Clara, as she always did back then, nodded, agreed, and let Julian handle it. Handling it was Julian's word for erasing her voice. With less than $300 left in her personal checking account, Clara drove her old, dented sedan through the pouring rain, watching the towering skyscrapers fade into gray, mist-covered hills. When she finally arrived at the address, her heart sank. The shop was a narrow, 2-story brick building, squeezed between a collapsed warehouse and a gravel parking lot. The green paint on the door was peeling like sunburned skin. The sign above, which once proudly read Vance Antique Clocks, was cracked in half. Clara stepped out into the damp air, her boots splashing in the puddles. She pulled the heavy iron key from the envelope, her hands trembling from the cold and the sheer exhaustion of her new reality. The lock resisted, grinding against years of rust and neglect, before finally turning with a heavy, metallic click. Inside, the air was cold, smelling of ancient dust, machine oil, and old paper. The silence in the room was absolute, yet it felt heavy, as if the shadows themselves were waiting for something. As Clara clicked on her flashlight, the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dozens of clocks lining the walls. Cuckoo clocks with frozen pendulums, elegant mahogany grandfather clocks standing like silent sentinels, and tiny brass pocket watches scattered across a massive oak workbench. Every single one of them had stopped. The time in her father's shop had frozen on the exact day he passed away, 12 years ago. On the center of the workbench, right next to a magnifying visor and a set of delicate tweezers, sat her father's old tin coffee mug. Beside it was a small leather-bound ledger. Clara approached the desk, her fingers brushing against the cold wood. She opened the ledger, expecting to see a list of unpaid bills or old customer names. But as she turned the yellowed pages, her breath hitched. Arthur Vance hadn't just been fixing gears and springs. In his neat, careful handwriting, written before the darkness took his sight entirely, he had recorded things that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with the human heart. The leather-bound book felt surprisingly heavy in Clara's hands, its edges darkened and smooth from the grease of her father's thumbs. Shivering from the chill that seemed to seep directly out of the concrete floor, she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and sat on an old wooden stool behind the counter. She wiped the dust off the ledger's cover with her sleeve and opened it to the very first page. The date at the top read October 12th, 1989. Her father's handwriting was different back then, bold, sharp, and confident, written long before the macular degeneration began to steal the light from his eyes. Clara felt a lump form in her throat as she began to read the ink lines. "Fix the mantel clock for Mrs. Gable today," the entry began. The mainspring was completely snapped and the gears were choked with soot from her fireplace. She brought it in crying, saying it was the last thing her husband bought her before he passed. She tried to hand me her wedding ring as collateral because she didn't have the $12 for the repair. I took the ring, put it in my pocket, and told her it would take a week. When she returned, I gave her the working clock and slipped the ring back into her coin purse while she was checking her coat, charged her $0. Some things are too sacred to be bought with copper. Clara turned the page, her heart pounding against her ribs. The next entry was from 1991. Young Marcus stopped by. His grandfather's pocket watch had stopped ticking. The boy was terrified because he thought he'd broken it. It wasn't broken. The balance wheel was just jammed with a bit of lint. I cleaned it in front of him, let him hold the eyeglass, and showed him how the heartbeat of the watch works. He didn't have a penny, but he offered to sweep the entire shop floor and polish the front windows. He did a damn fine job, too. Quiet kid, but he has the hands of a craftsman. Told him if he ever needs a safe place to sit when the streets get too loud, the corner stool is always open. Page after page, year after year, the ledger recorded a history of the town that no newspaper had ever printed. It wasn't a record of financial transactions or business profits. It was a map of human desperation and quiet, anonymous grace. Arthur Vance had kept a meticulous account of every broken family, every struggling widow, and every lonely soul in the valley. He didn't just fix their timepieces. He listened to the ticks of their lives, nodding when a family lost a job, when a child fell ill, or when a landlord was threatening eviction. As Clara read further, the handwriting began to change. The straight, elegant lines slowly became larger, shakier, and more erratic. The spacing became wider as her father began to lose his sight. By the mid-2000s, the entries were written with a thick black felt-tip marker, the letters clumping together as he fought against the creeping darkness. Yet, the content of the notes never shifted. Even when he could barely see the gears in front of him, working purely by the muscle memory of his fingertips and the micro-vibrations of the metal, he was still giving, still protecting, still forgiving debts. Then, near the middle of the book, Clara reached an entry dated May 14, 2011. The ink was slightly smudged, as if a drop of water had fallen on the page before it dried. Her own name stared back at her in giant, trembling letters. "Clara called from the city tonight," the marker read. She spoke fast, laughing too loud at things that weren't funny. She said Julian bought her a new diamond bracelet for their anniversary and that they were moving to a bigger house with a view of the river. She sounds so far away, not just in miles but in her soul. That man she married. He looks at a person and only sees an invoice. He counts the cost of everything and understands the value of nothing. She is trying so hard to fit into his gold-plated world, but I can hear the cracks in her voice. She gets that stubbornness from her mother, holding the walls up even when the roof is collapsing. I wish she would come home. I wish she would just come sit on the porch, let me teach her how to balance a hairspring again and drink that terrible chicory coffee she used to hate. But she won't. She's trapped in his schedule now. I just pray that if that gold cage ever breaks, she remembers where the key is hidden. Clara closed the ledger and pressed it hard against her chest, her body shaking as the tears finally spilled over, hot and uncontrollable. The absolute quiet of the dark shop surrounded her, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass. She had spent 30 years letting Julian tell her who she was, letting him convince her that her father was a small-town failure who died with nothing to his name. But sitting there on the dusty floor, holding the evidence of a beautifully lived life, Clara realized the truth. Julian was the one who was poor. Her father had died the richest man in the valley, buried under a mountain of gratitude he had never once thrown in anyone's face. As she wiped her eyes, her flashlight beam accidentally caught the face of the massive grandfather clock standing in the deepest shadow of the back wall. It was a beautiful, dark mahogany piece, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with an intricate brass face showing the phases of the moon. Unlike the other clocks, this one had a strange copper wire running from the bottom of the casing directly into the wood paneling behind the counter. Clara stood up, her knees cracking in the cold, and walked toward it, drawn by a sudden, intense curiosity. Clara approached the massive grandfather clock with a strange mix of reverence and hesitation. The flashlight beam danced across the intricate brass dial, where engraved stars and constellations decorated the phases of the moon mechanism. It was an absolute masterpiece of 19th-century horology, yet it felt out of place in this small, industrial town shop. As Clara moved closer, she noticed something peculiar that she hadn't seen from across the room. While every other clock in the shop had stopped at a random hour, whenever their mainsprings had finally run down after her father's death, this specific clock was different. Its heavy gold hands were pointed precisely at 12 o'clock. Both the hour and the minute hands were perfectly aligned, frozen at the exact midnight mark. She reached out, her fingers gently touching the cold glass door of the casing. It wasn't locked. The door swung open with a soft, mournful creak that echoed through the empty room. Clara expected to see the heavy lead weights and the long brass pendulum suspended inside, but the interior was completely empty. There were no weights, no pendulum, and no winding key. Instead, her eyes caught a small, polished brass dial built into the wooden back panel of the clock's interior, hidden well below where the mechanism usually sat. The dial had numbers stamped into the metal, ranging from 1 to 31, resembling an old safe combination or a calendar wheel. Suddenly, her father's words from the ledger flashed in her mind. "I just pray that if that gold cage ever breaks, she remembers where the key is hidden." Clara frowned, her mind racing. The key wasn't a physical object. Her father was a blind clockmaker. He didn't navigate the world with his eyes. He navigated it with numbers, sequences, and tactile feedback. He spent his life measuring time. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her childhood. She remembered her father sitting at the kitchen table, teaching her how to count the ticks of a balance wheel. "Every mechanical heart has a rhythm, Clara," he would say, his rough thumb tracing the side of her face. "If you lose your way, just look for the alignment." Alignment, 12 o'clock. She opened her eyes and looked at the brass calendar dial inside the clock. Today was May 16th, the exact date she had walked out of the courtroom, completely broken. She hesitated, then placed her fingers on the small brass wheel. She turned it slowly, feeling the solid mechanical clicks underneath her skin until the arrow pointed to the number 16. Nothing happened. The shop remained deadly quiet, save for the steady rhythm of the rain outside. She took a deep breath, thinking harder. Her father wouldn't make the code something transient like today's date. He would make it something permanent, something anchored in their shared history. She thought of her mother's passing, but that memory was too painful. Then she thought of the ledger page she had just read. The date at the top of his very first entry, the day he chose to start recording his quiet acts of kindness. October 12th. Clara turned the brass dial back to 12. As the wheel clicked into place, a deep, heavy sound resonated from within the hollow wooden casing of the clock. It wasn't a chime. It was the sound of heavy iron gears sliding across a metal track. With a smooth, well-oiled motion, the entire back panel of the grandfather clock swung inward like a hidden door, revealing a narrow, dark cavity built directly into the double-thick brick wall of the shop. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She shone her flashlight into the opening. Resting on a small velvet shelf inside was a heavy steel lockbox, identical to the ones used by banks in the early 1900s, and a long, handwritten letter sealed inside a thick parchment envelope. Her name, Clara, was written across the front in the giant, shaky black marker her father had used when the darkness was closing in. Her hands shook violently as she reached into the darkness of the clock and lifted the heavy steel box out. placing it carefully onto the dusty oak workbench. Before she could even touch the letter, the heavy green front door of the shop suddenly rattled. Clara jumped, her heart leaping into her throat as the shadow of a tall man appeared through the frosted glass window. The brass doorknob turned and the door pushed open, letting in a swirl of cold wind and rain. Clara stepped back into the shadows, gripping a heavy metal wrench from the bench. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice cracking with fear. "The shop is closed." A man in his late 30s stepped into the light, dripping wet. He wore a heavy canvas work jacket with grease stains on the sleeves and a baseball cap pulled low. He stopped just inside the doorway, blinking against the dim light, looking at the dozens of frozen clocks before his eyes finally settled on Clara. He slowly took off his cap, revealing a face that was weathered but inherently kind. "I saw the flashlight through the window from across the street," the man said, his voice deep and calm. "I didn't mean to scare you, ma'am. I'm Marcus Vance. Well, no relation to Arthur, just an old friend. I used to sweep this floor when I was just a terrified kid trying to stay out of trouble. You must be Clara, Arthur's daughter." Clara slowly lowered the wrench, the name Marcus echoing in her mind. It was the exact name from the ledger entry she had read just moments ago, the boy who had polished the windows and found a safe haven in her father's shop. Clara stood frozen by the workbench, her fingers still hovering near the lockbox she had just retrieved from the hollow center of the grandfather clock. Marcus did not move closer. He stayed near the doorway, letting the rain from his coat puddle on the concrete floor, giving her space to process his sudden appearance. He looked at the heavy steel box on the table, then at the open back panel of the clock, and a soft, knowing smile appeared beneath his tired eyes. "He actually did it," Marcus murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. "Arthur always told me that when the time was right, the gears would align for you. I thought the old man was just being poetic, but he was literal. He was always literal about numbers." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat, slowly letting go of the heavy wrench she was holding. "You knew my father well?" she asked, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Arthur Vance saved my life, ma'am," Marcus said simply, stepping forward just enough to pull up an old milk crate and sit down. "When I was 16, I was angry, stupid, and running with the wrong crowd in this valley. One night during a bad storm just like this one, I broke into this very shop through the back window. I was looking for brass or silver to sell. I thought a blind old man would be an easy target." Marcus looked down at his rough, calloused hands. But Arthur wasn't asleep. He was sitting right there on that stool in total darkness, listening. He didn't call the police. He didn't even yell. When I dropped a tray of pocket watches in panic, he just said, "The balance wheels on those are incredibly fragile, son. Pick them up carefully." He kept me here for 3 hours. He made me sweep the floor, and then he handed me a sandwich and a $10 bill. He told me that if I wanted to break things, I should learn how to put them back together first. I came back the next day, and the day after that. He taught me how to listen to machines. Today, I run the diesel repair shop 3 miles down the road. I have a family, a home, and a life, all because a blind man chose to see something in me that nobody else did. Clara felt a warm tear slip down her cheek. The contrast between her father's quiet, life-altering generosity and Julian's calculated, destructive greed was almost physically painful. She reached for the thick parchment envelope resting on the workbench. With trembling fingers, she slid her thumb under the wax seal and pulled out 2 folded sheets of yellowed legal paper. It was her father's handwriting, written in the large, bold black marker from his final days. "My dearest Clara," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means the golden cage you were living in has finally broken. I always knew it would, my sweet girl. Julian is a man who builds grand houses out of cards, and he measures the worth of a human being by the commas in their bank statement. I knew that one day he would take everything from you because men like him cannot stand to see someone hold onto their own soul. But he forgot one thing. He forgot about this shop. Clara leaned against the workbench, reading the words through a blur of tears as Marcus watched her silently. Julian's lawyers will tell you this place is a liability, a worthless piece of junk, the letter continued. Let them think that. Let them write it off. But what Julian doesn't know is that the land this shop stands on sits directly over the natural spring that supplies the entire lower valley. 30 years ago, before you married him, the town council wanted to buy this land to build a massive commercial water treatment plant that would have ruined the local ecosystem and forced dozens of families off their farms. I refused to sell. Instead, I signed a perpetual covenant with the town, a legal trust. The shop cannot be demolished, and the land cannot be sold to private developers as long as a Vance bloodline holds the deed. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the next paragraph, her eyes widening. Inside the steel lockbox next to this letter, you will find the original copy of that covenant, along with something else. Over 40 years, every time I did a free repair or lent money to a neighbor, I didn't ask for interest. I asked them to sign a share in a community cooperative. This shop doesn't just belong to us, Clara. It belongs to the whole valley. And more importantly, the valley belongs to this shop. If Julian ever tries to come after you, or if you ever find yourself on the street with nothing but your name, just open the front door. Turn the lights on. The people of this town have been paying me back in silence for decades. It's time for them to pay you. Clara looked up from the letter, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She looked at Marcus, who was smiling softly. He knew, Clara whispered. He knew exactly what would happen. We all knew, Clara, Marcus said, standing up and walking toward the counter. Your father didn't just fix clocks. He held this entire community together with his bare hands. And right now, your ex-husband's lawyers are realizing they made a very, very big mistake. Steel lockbox sat on the oak workbench like a time capsule waiting for its moment. Marcus stepped closer, his heavy flashlight illuminating the scratched, dark metal. Clara looked down at the rusted key her father had left her in the envelope, the only physical thing Julian's high-priced lawyers hadn't bothered to double-check. Her hand was cold, but it didn't shake this time. She slid the key into the small, narrow keyhole. It didn't turn easily. It required a firm, deliberate twist, a reminder that Arthur Vance never made anything simple or fragile. With a loud, metallic pop that sounded like a pistol shot in the quiet room, the heavy latch broke free. Clara slowly lifted the lid. A scent of old cedar wood and dried lavender escaped from the dark interior. Inside, neatly organized, were the true foundations of her father's secret life. On the top lay a thick stack of official, blue-bordered legal documents, the perpetual covenant with the town council from 1982, bearing the gold seals of the county court. Underneath the trust paperwork lay something that made Clara gasp. It was a velvet bag filled with old silver Morgan dollars and rare pre-war gold coins, shining dimly in the flashlight beam. Next to the money was a massive stack of index cards, thousands of them, tied together with faded kitchen twine. Clara picked up the top bundle of cards and untied the knot. Each card was dedicated to a single family in the lower valley. They weren't promissory notes or debt receipts. They were certificates of cooperative membership. On each card, in her father's careful block lettering, was a record of a moment. January 1994. Repaired the main irrigation pump for the Miller farm. $0 charged. In exchange, Jonathan Miller pledges 2 days of manual labor and timber to the Vance Trust whenever Arthur's daughter shall require it. The card was signed at the bottom in shaky blue ink by Jonathan Miller himself. He picked up another card. August 2001. Paid the overdue winter heating bill for Sarah Jenkins and her 3 children, $300. In exchange, Sarah pledges her professional bookkeeping and accounting services to the Vance Trust upon request. Page after page, name after name. The entire valley had signed their names to this invisible, silent network of honor. Arthur Vance hadn't been giving charity. He had been building an army of debtors who owed their survival to his kindness. And every single contract was legally binding under the terms of the trust, specifically designed to activate the moment Clara unlocked the box. "My God," Clara whispered, her eyes burning as she touched the rough signatures of people she had never met. "He didn't leave me a worthless piece of real estate. He left me a fortress." Marcus smiled, a deep, emotional look in his eyes as he leaned against the counter. "Julian counts his wealth in banks that don't know his face, Clara. Arthur counted his wealth in the people who would die for him. I told you, the valley remembers, and mountain news travels faster than the internet." The rain finally stopped just before dawn, leaving the valley covered in a thick, silver mist that smelled of wet earth and pine needles. Clara fell asleep for a few hours on an old cot in the small stockroom upstairs, wrapped in her father's old wool-work jacket. She woke up to a sound she hadn't heard in years, the deep, rhythmic rumble of heavy diesel engines pulling up onto the gravel lot outside the shop. Panic flashed through her chest for a fraction of a second. Had Julian's lawyers sent demolition crews already? Had they found a loophole? She ran down the narrow wooden stairs, her heart hammering against her ribs, and threw open the heavy green front door. She stopped dead on the porch, her breath catching in her throat. The gravel lot wasn't filled with bulldozers. It was filled with pickup trucks, flatbed trailers, and old sedans. At least 30 people were standing in the soft morning light, their breath forming faint white clouds in the crisp mountain air. There were old farmers in denim overalls, young mechanics with grease under their fingernails, and elderly women holding large wicker baskets covered in white cloths. In the center of the crowd stood Marcus, holding a massive industrial broom. Beside him was an older man with white hair, carrying a toolbox that looked like it had seen 40 years of hard labor. The white-haired man stepped forward, taking off his worn canvas cap as he looked up at Clara on the porch. "Morning, Clara." His voice was rough but steady. "I'm Jonathan Miller. Your daddy fixed my family's farm when the bank was ready to take it. Marcus told us you came home last night, and he told us that city bastard is trying to take Arthur's roof from over your head." Jonathan turned and pointed to the flatbed truck behind him, which was loaded with fresh timber, buckets of paint, and stacks of new glass panels. 30 years ago, I signed a card in that shop. I told your father that if his daughter ever needed hands to build, my hands belonged to her. Well, the valley is here to pay its rent. Let's get to work." Clara stood on the old wooden porch, unable to find her voice as the valley went to work. Before the morning sun could even burn the silver fog off the mountain road, Jonathan Miller's sons had already unloaded the flatbed truck. The empty, silent lot was suddenly filled with the sharp, rhythmic sounds of hammers hitting steel, hand saws cutting through fresh pine, and loud, good-natured laughter echoing against the brick walls. Clara tried to offer them coffee, but Mrs. Jenkins, the very woman whose winter heating bill her father had paid a decade ago, pushed past her with 2 giant metal thermoses and a basket filled with warm, homemade biscuits. "You sit down, Clara," Sarah Jenkins said with a firm but incredibly gentle pat on her shoulder. "You've been fighting alone for too long. Today, let the valley carry the weight." By noon, the transformation was nothing short of a miracle. Marcus had taken down the cracked glass windows from the shop front, replacing them with thick, crystal-clear panes that let the bright afternoon light flood the dark interior. A young painter from town, using the cards from the lockbox as his reference, sat on a wooden ladder with a fine-tipped brush, carefully restoring the gold leaf lettering on the front sign, Vance Antique Clocks. The peeling, sunburned green doors were scrubbed down and coated in a deep, rich hunter green that made the brass doorknob shine like new. But the real magic happened inside. Marcus, along with 3 other local mechanics who had learned their trade from Arthur, spent hours delicately cleaning the dust and dried oil from the gears of the wall clocks. Clara watched in absolute awe as Marcus stepped up to the massive, 8-foot grandfather clock that had hidden her father's secret vault. He carefully adjusted the heavy weights, checked the balance wheel by touch just as her father used to do, and gently swung the heavy brass pendulum. A deep, resonant tick echoed through the room. Then another, and then, as if a spell had been broken across the entire valley, the other clocks followed. The cuckoo clocks, the small brass pocket watches, the elegant mahogany mantel timepieces. Hundreds of mechanical hearts began to beat all at once. The shop was no longer a tomb for dead memories. It was a living, breathing machine of time, filled with a beautiful, synchronized symphony of seconds. The celebration, however, was cut short at exactly 3 o'clock. The smooth, expensive hum of a modern black sedan pulled into the freshly raked gravel lot, its polished chrome wheels kicking up dust. The door opened, and a man in a pristine charcoal suit, holding a stiff leather briefcase, stepped out. It was Felton, Julian's lead attorney, the very same man who had handed Clara her divorce papers with a smirk just weeks ago. He looked at the crowd of rugged farmers and mechanics with immediate disgust, carefully adjusting his tie as he walked toward the porch. The loud sounds of hammering and talking instantly died down. The symphony of ticks inside the shop suddenly felt incredibly loud. Jonathan Miller stepped in front of the porch stairs, his massive, calloused hands resting on his tool belt, blocking Felton's path. "Can I help you, city boy?" Jonathan asked, his voice low and dangerous. Felton didn't look at him. He looked past his shoulder, fixing his cold, calculated eyes directly on Clara, who was standing in the doorway of the shop. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick document stamped with a bright red legal seal. "Clara Vance," Felton announced, his voice echoing sharply across the quiet lot. "I am here on behalf of Julian Vance. We have filed an emergency injunction with the county court. This property is being placed under immediate receivership pending a valuation dispute. You are ordered to cease all unauthorized modifications to this structure and vacate the premises within 24 hours. If you refuse, the local sheriff will remove you for trespassing." Clara felt a familiar, cold wave of panic wash over her. Julian was using his wealth again, throwing heavy legal weight around to crush her spirit before she could even stand up. But before she could take a step forward, a heavy hand rested on her shoulder. It was Marcus. He stepped out onto the porch, looking down at the high-priced attorney with a calm, steady smile. "You're a long way from the city, counselor," Marcus said, his voice entirely unbothered. "But if you're looking for the sheriff, you don't have to look very far." From the back of the crowd, a white SUV with the County Star emblem on the side quietly pulled up. The door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tan uniform stepped out, his leather duty belt clicking as he walked toward the porch. It was Sheriff Thomas. He looked at Felton, then at the document in the lawyer's hand, and then up at Clara. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Felton?" the sheriff asked, tipping his hat slightly. "Sheriff, thank goodness," Felton said, his confident smirk returning. "This woman is violating a pending court order. I need you to clear this lot and secure this building immediately." Sheriff Thomas took the document from Felton's hand, looked at it for exactly 3 seconds, and then handed it right back. "Well now, that's a real nice piece of paper, counselor, but it seems your boss didn't do his homework. This property isn't private real estate anymore. It's a registered historical community trust, protected by a perpetual covenant signed in 1982. In this county, a trust covenant outranks a civil separation dispute every single day of the week. Miss Vance isn't trespassing. She's the trustee. But you're blocking a commercial driveway, So unless you want a ticket for illegal parking, I suggest you get back in your pretty little car and drive back to the city." News of Felton's humiliating defeat on the steps of the clock shop traveled back to the city faster than the luxury sedan could drive the interstate. For the first time in his life, Julian Vance felt the cold, creeping sensation of losing control. He had built his entire career on the absolute certainty that everything and everyone had a price tag. If a landowner refused to sell, you doubled the offer. If they still refused, you hired a bigger law firm to find a technicality and bury them in legal fees until they broke. But a historical community trust, a binding covenant signed over 40 years ago by a blind man who didn't care about money. It was a wall his wealth couldn't immediately breach. 2 days after the encounter with the sheriff, Clara was sitting behind the freshly polished oak counter, cataloging the index cards from her father's lockbox. The shop was quiet, the gentle, synchronized tick-tock of 100 antique clocks providing a soothing rhythm that she had quickly grown to love. Suddenly, her modern smartphone shattered the peace, buzzing violently against the historic wood. The screen displayed her daughter's name, Keely. Clara took a deep breath before answering. During the brutal 2-year divorce battle, Keely had quietly sided with her father. It wasn't out of malice. Julian simply possessed the answers. He had the money, the high-powered connections, and a perfectly rehearsed version of reality where Clara was unstable, unreasonable, and incapable of managing her own life. Keely, living in her father's gold-plated world, had accepted that narrative because agreeing with Julian was always easier than fighting him. "Keely, sweetie, hello," Clara said, keeping her voice as calm as possible. "Mom, are you actually living in that old building?" Keely's voice sounded tight, anxious, and laced with genuine worry. "Dad just came home from a meeting with his board of investors, and I've never seen him like this. He was furious, Mom. He was throwing papers across his study. He said you're trying to ruin his entire northern development project out of spite." Clara leaned back against the high stool, looking at her father's old reading glasses resting next to the ledger. "This isn't about spite, Keely. It never was. Your father's lawyers tried to take this place because they thought it was worthless junk, but they didn't do their research. This land belongs to a community trust. Your grandfather protected it to save the valley's water supply. I am just honoring his will." "Mom, you don't understand how Dad operates," Keely pleaded, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "He doesn't care about a local trust. He's already contacting state senators to see if they can use eminent domain to force you out for the highway expansion. He says you're being completely unreasonable, living in a condemned structure and playing savior to a town that doesn't matter. He's driving up there himself tomorrow, Mom. He's coming to end this. Why won't you just take a settlement? Let him buy you an apartment in the city. Start over properly. Why are you risking a war over an old gas station and clock shop?" Clara looked at the front window. Outside, through the clean glass, she could see Jonathan Miller unloading another stack of firewood for the shop's ancient stove. Next to him, Marcus was laughing, helping an elderly woman carry her groceries across the gravel lot. These people hadn't abandoned her when the city lawyers showed up. They had stood like a wall. "Because for 30 years, Keely, I lived in your father's version of the world," Clara said, her voice dropping into a steady, unshakable register that her daughter had never heard before. "I signed where he pointed. I smiled when he told me to smile. I agreed because it was easier than fighting, and I lost my soul in the process. I didn't respect myself, and honestly, I don't blame you for not respecting me back then either. But that Clara is gone. Your father spent his life measuring the cost of everything and understanding the value of nothing. I am not selling this place. Not for $1 million and not for a state injunction. Tell him to drive up. The doors are open." Before Keely could reply, Clara quietly pressed the end call button. She set the phone down and didn't look at it again. She stood up, walked over to the ancient copper kettle and made a fresh pot of coffee. She didn't feel the panic anymore. She felt a deep, profound sense of peace. She was finally home, and she was ready for whatever morning would bring. Julian Vance arrived exactly 3 days later, and just like in the valley's oldest legends, you could hear him coming long before you saw him. The deep, smooth, predatory hum of his brand-new silver SUV vibrated through the gravel lot before the vehicle even rounded the curve. It was a flawless piece of engineering, costing more than most families in the lower valley earned in an entire year. Julian climbed out, looking remarkably young for his 61 years, tanned, trim. Wearing a crisp navy polo and perfectly pressed khakis, he put on his designer sunglasses and paused on the driveway, studying the shop the exact same way he studied high-yield real estate properties before buying them. He was assessing the bones, looking for the fracture points. He walked inside, taking his time, his leather loafers completely silent against the newly scrubbed wooden floorboards. The absolute wall of synchronized tick-tocks hit him instantly, but he didn't blink. He looked at the fresh hunter green paint, the sparkling glass windows, and the beautifully restored sign outside. "Nice little charity project, Clara," Julian said, his voice smooth, warm, and dripping with the rehearsed charm he used on investors. He took off his sunglasses, his sharp blue eyes measuring the room, calculating the fastest, cheapest way to get exactly what he wanted. "Arthur's old place. I think we drove out here once when we were dadding. It smelled like machine grease back then." Clara didn't stand up from her stool. She kept her hands resting flat on the heavy oak counter, right next to her father's reading glasses. "You didn't drive 3 hours from the city to talk about my father, Julian." Julian smiled, a polite corporate expression that didn't reach his eyes. He reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a sleek, gold-plated pen along with a folded document. He slid it across the counter, stopping it right over the old ledger. "I came because I thought we could talk like reasonable adults before the lawyers make this incredibly ugly," Julian said, leaning against the counter as if they were discussing a minor zoning issue. "Let's be honest, Clara, the property is undervalued. You know it and I know it. The new highway expansion is passing within a mile of this exact junction. In 24 months, this land will be worth 10 times what the divorce appraisers valued it for. I want what's fair." "Fair," Clara repeated the word, and for the first time it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded funny. "Fair is a word you use the way other men use a handshake, Julian. It sounds perfectly reasonable until a person actually reads your terms. You got the penthouse. You got the investment portfolios, the offshore accounts, the summer estate. You got every single asset we built over 30 years, except a small-town clock shop that your own legal team called a worthless teardown. And now you want this too." "I want what the court should have considered," Julian said, his voice tightening slightly, the corporate charm beginning to fray at the edges. "If an asset appreciates due to municipal development, it should be divided equitably. You're holding on to this dump out of spite, Clara. Be practical. Look at that document. I am offering you $500,000 cash right now. You can buy a luxury condo in the city. You can travel. You can start over properly. Why fight a war you can't afford to win?" Clara looked at him, really looked at him. He was standing in a historic valley workshop, surrounded by generations of human gratitude, wearing clothes that cost more than the local monthly fuel bill, trying to buy her soul for the second time. "You're right about one thing, Julian," Clara said softly, standing up to her full height. "This place is worth something. It's worth an incredible amount of money, just not the kind of currency you will ever understand." Julian stared at her, his jaw tightening. Clara could see the invisible script falling apart behind his eyes. The calculated conversation was going completely sideways. He had driven up here expecting the Clara he remembered, the woman who signed wherever the pen pointed, the one who agreed because agreeing was easier than facing his wrath. But that woman had died the moment she turned the gears of her father's clock. "I'll see you in court, Clara," Julian said, his voice dropping all pretense of warmth. He snapped his gold pen shut, turned on his heel, and walked out. The gravel popped violently under his tires as the silver SUV tore out of the lot, disappearing around the mountain curve. Marcus stepped out from the back repair bay, holding a heavy wrench he hadn't actually been using. He looked at Clara, then at the dust settling on the driveway. "You all right, boss?" Clara looked at her father's reading glasses and the unfinished crossword puzzle on the desk. "I don't have a city lawyer, Marcus, and I don't have the money for one. So honestly, I don't know. But I'm not leaving." Clara barely slept that night. The echo of Julian's silver SUV leaving the lot had faded, but the weight of his threat hung heavily in the cool mountain air. She knew how his world operated. Tomorrow, his legal team would begin a slow, suffocating war of attrition. But the next morning, the front door of the shop opened not to a process server, but to a crisp, gray sedan. An elderly woman stepped out. She was in her late 60s, tall and straight-backed, wearing a sharp navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it had seen every courtroom in the state. Her reading glasses hung from a silver chain around her neck. She walked onto the porch, looked at Clara, and didn't offer a polite smile. "You're Arthur's daughter," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Evelyn Vance, no relation to your father, just a retired corporate litigator. Marcus called me last night. He told me Julian Vance's sharks are trying to circle this reef." Clara blinked, surprised. "Evelyn, I don't know if I can afford a defense attorney right now. My husband's lawyers have millions." Evelyn cut her off with a wave of her dry, firm hand, walking directly past her to the oak counter. "Sit down, Clara. Let me tell you a story about numbers. 32 years ago, my daughter Clara, yes, she shares your name, needed an immediate congenital heart valve replacement. The insurance company called it a pre-existing condition and refused to pay a single cent. The cost was $3,200. In 1994, that was a fortune. I was a young, struggling public defender. I didn't have it." Evelyn unzipped her briefcase, her eyes softening just a fraction. "One morning, the hospital administrator called me into the office. He told me the bill had been paid in full by an anonymous donor through a local medical fund. The only condition was that I was never to be told the identity of the giver. It took me 15 years to trace the bank routing number back to a tiny commercial account right here in this valley. It belonged to Vance Antique Clocks. Your father, running a business on a road nobody used, completely blind, saved my daughter's life. He never asked for a receipt. He never even told me his name. So you don't owe me a dime, Clara. This defense was paid for in full 32 years ago." 6 weeks later, the hearing took place in the small, darkwood-paneled county courthouse. The air inside smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Julian sat in the front row, his arms crossed, wearing a charcoal bespoke suit that looked ridiculous in the modest country courtroom. Felton sat beside him, surrounded by 3 thick leather binders of municipal codes, real estate appraisals, and highway development projections. The hearing lasted exactly 20 minutes. Felton stood up first, delivering a highly technical, aggressive speech about equitable distribution, potential future commercial appreciation, and the hidden marital value of the property. He threw out terms like speculative asset allocation and material concealment with the confidence of a man who had never lost an argument. When he finally sat down, Evelyn Vance stood up. She didn't use a binder. She didn't use 3 assistants. She walked to the center of the courtroom carrying exactly 3 pieces of paper from Arthur's lockbox: the original 1971 family deed, her father's notarized will, and a certified copy of the 1982 Historical Community Trust Covenant. "Your Honor," Evelyn's voice was calm, clear, and carried the immense weight of 40 years of legal mastery. The plaintiff's entire argument rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of property law. This land passed directly from Arthur Vance's father to Arthur, and from Arthur solely to his daughter Clara. It was never jointly held. It was never commingled with marital assets. The plaintiff's own legal team assessed this property during the initial divorce proceedings, valued it at an insignificant amount, and formally waived all rights to it to expedite their client's settlement. Furthermore, under the terms of the 1982 Community Covenant, this land cannot be sold or exploited for private commercial gain as long as a Vance bloodline holds the title. Speculative future value from a municipal highway is entirely irrelevant. The motion to reopen this settlement is a textbook example of a nuisance claim designed to intimidate a single mother. The judge reviewed the documents over his reading glasses for less than a minute. He looked down at Felton, then at Julian, whose face was slowly turning a deep, angry shade of red. "Motion denied," the judge said, slamming his wooden gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed off the high ceiling. The property was separate prior to the marriage, separate during the marriage, and separate at dissolution. This matter is permanently closed. Outside on the courthouse steps, the afternoon sun was warm and golden. Clara walked toward her old sedan, her shoulders lighter than they had been in 30 years. Suddenly, she heard fast, heavy footsteps behind her. She turned. It was Julian. His jacket was thrown over his arm, his pristine hair slightly messy from the humidity. The absolute corporate confidence was still there, but something behind his eyes had cracked. He looked tired, not from a lack of sleep, but from the realization that his wealth had failed him. "When did you become this person, Clara?" he asked, his voice raw, looking at her as if she were a total stranger. "The woman I married would have signed the settlement weeks ago." Clara looked at him, the man she had spent her youth trying to please, the man who had built an entire kingdom on paper and missed everything that actually mattered. "I always was this person, Julian," Clara said, her voice entirely devoid of anger. "You just never bothered to look." She turned, got into her car, and drove back to the valley. By the time May arrived, the dogwoods along the mountain road were in full, spectacular bloom. Soft white and pink blossoms pressed against the deep green canopy of the forest, and the valley air smelled of warm earth, fresh pine needles, and new growth. Spring had come to the mountains the way it always did, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, and then all at once. The clock repair shop was no longer just a building on a forgotten corner. It was alive. The front doors stayed open from 6 in the morning until well after sunset. Marcus handled the heavy mechanical repairs in the back bay, his hands moving with the confident, steady focus he had inherited from Arthur. Clara had stopped counting the number of pocket watches, grandfather clocks, and antique timepieces arriving on her counter because there were simply enough. The shop's ancient copper kettle never went cold, providing a continuous stream of fresh coffee for anyone who needed a place to sit. The old wooden porch had naturally evolved into the community's central gathering place. Regulars arrived in the late afternoon with folding lawn chairs that they left leaning against the brick wall between visits. An older farmer had brought a handmade checkerboard and left it on the porch railing, triggering a running tournament that nobody kept official score of, but everyone took incredibly seriously. Clara learned every single one of their names, their families, and their troubles. She kept this information hidden away, exactly as her father had, not in a digital spreadsheet, but in her heart and in her quiet actions. When a local family fell behind on groceries, an anonymous envelope wrapped in brown paper would find its way into their mailbox. Clara never announced what she was doing. Nobody asked. The valley absorbed her generosity the way it had absorbed Arthur's for 40 years, as a natural, beautiful part of how life was supposed to work. On a warm Saturday afternoon, a familiar rental car pulled into the freshly raked gravel lot. Keely stepped out, but this time, she wasn't alone. From the back seat emerged her two children, a 9-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl, both wearing crisp city clothes and looking around with wide, curious eyes at a world entirely different from their own. "This is where your great-grandfather Arthur worked," Keely told them, her voice soft and entirely free of the anxiety that used to define her. The little boy studied the historic brick building. "It's kind of small, Mom." "It's exactly big enough, sweetie," Clara said, stepping out onto the porch with a warm smile. She spent the afternoon taking her grandchildren through the magic of the workshop. She opened the historic cash register, letting the little girl ring up an imaginary sale just to hear the heavy mechanical ding. She took the boy to the back bay, where Marcus paused his work to lift the child up, showing him the massive pegboard where every single tool sat perfectly within its hand-drawn outline. Clara showed him how to use a tiny magnifying loupe to look at the microscopic hairspring of a gold pocket watch. As the boy looked through the lens, his face lit up with the exact same wide, fascinated grin that Clara had worn 50 years ago in this very room. Keely watched the entire scene from the doorway, her arms crossed, a soft, emotional expression resting on her face. What was in her eyes wasn't worry or judgment anymore. It was recognition. She was finally seeing her mother clearly. That evening, after the children had fallen asleep on the old wool blanket cot upstairs, Clara and Keely sat together on the front porch benches. The mountain sky was perfectly clear, thick with a brilliant carpet of cold white stars. "I was wrong, Mom," Keely said quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of her warm coffee mug. "About this place, about you, about Dad." Clara didn't push. She had learned the value of silence from her father. You don't force people to see the gears. You just let the clock tick until they arrive at the truth on their own. "Your father isn't a monster, Keely," Clara said softly, reaching over to gently squeeze her daughter's hand. "He is just a man who spent his whole life measuring the wrong things." The next morning, before they drove back to the city, Jonathan Miller walked into the shop carrying a small package wrapped in heavy brown paper. He set it carefully on the counter and slid it toward Clara. "Found this in my attic while clearing out some old trunks," Jonathan said, tipping his cap. "It belonged to my father. It's been sitting in the dark for too long." Clara unwrapped the paper. Inside was an old, slightly faded photograph framed behind a dusty sheet of glass. It was a picture of a young Arthur Vance, standing proudly in front of the freshly painted shop front, his arm resting gently around the shoulder of a 6-year-old Clara who was wearing oversized denim overalls and laughing into the sun. "Your dad gave a copy to my father after he took it," Jonathan murmured. "He told him it was the only photograph he ever needed, because it was the only time both of you looked exactly like who you were always supposed to be." After Jonathan left, Clara carried the frame behind the counter. She drove a small brass nail into the wall, hanging the photograph directly next to her father's old reading glasses and the leather-bound ledger. 3 objects from a blind man who had been gone for over a decade, yet his heartbeat was still dictating the rhythm of the entire valley. Clara stepped back, looking at the image of her younger self and her father. The shop around her was filled with the steady, beautiful symphony of 100 ticking clocks, and for the first time in her life, Clara knew exactly who she was. She was home.